There we go. So good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I think perhaps we should get straight down to business because Norman has got some exciting findings to share with us. So just as a quick reminder, Norman, it might be useful to talk about the purpose and your research questions before you start getting into some of your findings.
Yeah, it's how exciting these findings are. I mean, I guess it depends how we define exciting. But so this master's paper I'm submitting is, I mean, essentially it was an investigation into the effect of teacher professional development in the iHoM and the influence that would have on teacher belief around this epistemic cognition. Research question was, to what extent does TPD around the habits of mind influence teacher belief around the habits of mind being embedded in the curriculum? Now, the reason for this research, let me tell you why I did this. And it's in many ways, it's quite a simple kind of study, but I'm an advocate for the voice of teachers. And there's a lot of research out there in this world right now that says, you know, if there's something lacking in education, it's actually, you know, globally, it's that we don't listen to the teachers enough. And one of the things I wanted to do was to, and if you like, that research can be driven simply by something that piques your interest or a notion. And I guess that's got what got me started, is having a lot of conversations with teachers who, you know, there was kind of uncertainty around the habits of mind for a whole number of reasons, but there seemed to be an underlying sense of belief in their values. So I wanted to conduct this study literally not to draw any particular conclusion, but rather to find areas that might be considered worthy of further research and deeper study. Okay, and the way that this unfolded was I used a semi-structured interviews and a thematic analysis. So it worked like this. They were interview one, there were a set of 6 framing questions, but there was a lot of opportunity for nuance and the tangential, if you like. Then they did the first learning path from the EduPlanet learning path on the habits of mind, which is, you know, it seems quite a neat learning path. It's got a good variety of sort of the philosophy and some classroom practice. And then they went through the same interview again. Okay, so and what I attempted to do was to see if anything had shifted between interview 1 and interview 2. And of course, this wasn't just looking only at the effectiveness of the habits of mind. If you like, that whole interview, TPD interview process, that was just an iterative process that's part of the habit of mind project. Okay, so it's a series of small steps within this huge journey that, you know, schools are on with the iHoM. And it was interesting. So, you know, I had these interviews, transcribed the interviews, and by the way, I'll call out here for a wonderful coding tool called MaxQDA, which I use not to its full potential. I still did most of the coding, if you like, the intuitive parts from my own understanding and thinking, but it's an extraordinary tool for organizing the coding of transcripts. So where did all this lead up to? It led me to posit a couple of significant things that I think we all need to be aware of in the habits of mind community. And what are those things? Firstly, we, as, for example, this institute, us on this Zoom call, we have great passion for the iHoM and epistemic cognition and seeing how that, seeing the value of it in education and in life generally. And between us, we probably know quite a lot about it. But what I'll caveat that by saying I still believe, regardless of how many decades we are now into sort of rolling out these things in schools, we're still very much at the beginning of the journey. Because if I could observe something that was overarching to everything I analyzed and saw and found, it was there's still quite a lot of gap. There's a big gap, actually. I call it a deficit between what is understood at the theoretical level, you know, what is known, the literature that's out there, and then how this stuff really plays out in the classroom. You know, what does that really look like in terms of learning activities? What does that really look like through the eyes of a teacher? Because ultimately they're the guys in the classroom who are rolling this stuff out. So there are, the way I do this, so let me explain the things I believe I discovered potentially. None of these are necessarily conclusive things because it's a small scale study. But through my coding, and I used the codes to drive the identification of themes. It was a thematic analysis. So I'm just going to share with you what those themes actually are, what I found. So here we go. Theme 1. So these are all just things for you to think about, if you like. And by all means, if anyone wants to get in touch with me individually to talk more about these issues, I'm happy to. The first theme that seemed to come through was teacher understanding of the habits of mind, innate or taught. And what I mean, there was a fair amount of dialogue in both sets of interviews around teachers just trying to understand that, had a better grasp on whether the habits of mind are kind of innate, common sense attributes of human nature that just evolve over time and deepen and develop, or are they things that can truly be taught? Okay, so there's theme 1, and that's an interesting one. It didn't surprise me. Again, these were, you know, these responses were through, you know, a fairly positive lens. I mean, that was the theoretical side that the teachers really wanted to understand more about. Having said that, the interesting thing in these interviews was that there was a much greater focus from the teachers on the practical side rather than the theoretical. In fact, I ran a search through the coding results, and actually there was something like, of all the questions the teachers came back with, something like 85 of those questions were how questions and only 10 were why questions. So it was interesting that teachers were much more engaged with the practical than the theoretical. The next thing that I arrived at was the conceptual role of the habits of mind teacher. So what I mean by that is this wasn't looking at, you know, the very basic mechanics of the teacher role and, you know, what they do in the class. It was, what does their role actually represent, you know, in the school community, in the classroom? Are they there to be a role model? Are they there to try and seek buy-in to the habits of mind from the students and to gain support for the, if you like, the iHoM movement? That overarching idea is, okay, I'm a practitioner of the iHoM. What does that actually mean? What does that represent really? That was an interesting one for me. The next theme that I've written about was, well, this one is where is the deficit? So that's a little bit alluding to what I spoke to about earlier, which is this gap between the theoretical and the practical. So that deficit represented things that teachers raised in these interviews that was more aligned with, this is what I haven't got. This is what I need more of. And you would see things coming through there, like they need more real world examples, to have a look at other schools. How are other schools doing this? How do other people play this out in the classroom? Tell me more about how to connect these habits to the units of learning. Tell me more about how to identify these habits in a student, and to know when a habit is playing out and when a habit isn't playing out. You see, there's your deficit. You've got some brilliant understanding and brilliant literature out there around the concepts and the philosophical underpinnings of epistemic cognition. But this is the critical part of the teacher voice. It's, okay, show me what to do. Involve me. And you remember, it always comes back to my mind, the old adage that says, tell me, I'll probably forget. Show me, I might remember. Involve me, and then I'll understand. And it's that concept that the teachers want to be much more deeply involved with, what is actually going on in the classroom? What is it we are asking them to do? There's your deficit, okay? And the next theme was, I'm just scrolling through. I do know these themes, but it's very early in the morning, and I haven't had enough coffee to stimulate my own epistemic cognition. The next one was assessing the habits of mind. Now, guys, this is a big one, because as a school here, at the school that Philip and myself and Daryl and Andrew work at, we are assessing these habits of mind as intrinsic components of our learning units, okay? And I think we're doing, a pretty good job at refining that process. We're not there yet, but if you look at the literature, there's very, very little out there that talks about the nature of HOM assessment in schools. In fact, the majority of it will only report on what we call self-reported assessment, maybe where, people are just assessing themselves on particular habits or evaluating themselves. But there's not, given that we are a school that is actually trying to assess the HOM with some kind of value that even plays out on the student report card, I believe we are possibly pioneering that, because I don't think there's much out there to inform us of that. And of course, what teachers came up with in these interviews was, questions like, should we assess the habits? Can the habits be assessed? How can I be better equipped as a teacher to assess the habits of mind? And this isn't surprising, is it? Because if you think about it, these habits of mind are, these are deep and complex dispositions grounded in psychology and neuroscience. Many teachers out there, may have only had a few hours, real exposure to professional development and so on. So, they want to know more. What does this assessment really look like? And also the authenticity of assessment. So there was some concern that maybe sometimes these, if you're just getting students to write a journal and reflect, that it could be somewhat contrived, in the sense that they know what the teacher wants to hear. They know what the teacher wants to read to get a reasonable grade within the domain of the HOM. So assessment, big theme. And again, we could talk for hours on that. I could, go through, because there are so many strands to assessment. And now we have the dimensions of growth as a component of that. Well, so too much to be said on that one. But again, it's another theme. And then we moved on to teacher commitment to the habits of mind. Because one of the actual questions I did ask in these semi-structured interviews, and this actually, thank you to yourself, Benna, because we had some dialogue around how to frame these questions. And one of them was, to what extent are you committed to mastering the habits of mind? And of course, that fed off into other questions like, what's your commitment to learning? Do you want to sort of do specific learning around the HOM and so on? And the good news is that the teachers are very bought into the HOM. They're very they're very much of the view, this small sample I looked at, that the HOM absolutely have a place in schools. In fact, in many ways, the teachers were quite reflective and positive around saying that even through the learning path, that this had made it, given them a bit of a wake-up call that these habits were actually attributes that were really worthy, not just as a teacher in the classroom, but actually for all of us as human beings. And it would be somewhat, a noble pursuit for each of them to develop these HOMs better in themselves. And this is what they talked about. So the commitment to mastery of the habits of mind, to continue on this learning journey with us as a school and the HOM community was very, very strong. And it is one of the areas that the learning path, the TPD, did seem to have an impact, because they sort of generally said yes when I did that TPT. It galvanized my position with the HOMs, and I want to go further on to learn more. I want to read more, and so on. The last theme was the obvious one, which was the effectiveness of the teacher professional development, the learning paths. They only did the one learning path. It was a small scale project. We couldn't possibly put them through all of the TPD, especially during sort of pandemic times, I guess. But generally, they were positive about the learning path. There was strong supportive feedback actually about the variation in the learning path, that it was a mixture of videos and readings and reflections and chats with that cohort. So there were positives. One of the things they all wanted to see more of was they really want to see more videos of people practicing these HOMs in class, real life hands-on situations with students, to hear from other schools, to hear from other people within the community, really giving them that, if we go back to the theme of the deficit, giving them stuff that might help them make up that deficit. They seemed less inclined for the theoretical side at this point, but this may be because they're quite new in the journey, and sometimes when we're very new to something, we just want to know how to do it. Then maybe later on we come back and say, well, actually now I want to get way more into the theory and so on, but let's see how that plays out. But the TPD, generally positive views that it did have some sort of effect on these teachers, but obviously there are other learning paths that they can go through next. This was only the beginning. So those are the 6 significant themes that came through. And obviously that's all well and good, but it's where do we go with this? And as I venture into that dark place tonight of beginning to write my conclusions and plunge myself into metacognitive hell, I will draw certain conclusions that I think are becoming very clear. And one of them is probably what the very first idea behind this research paper was, is that we need to do a hell of a lot more research and study. And I think one key area I would strongly suggest that someone somewhere takes forward is more research into assessment of habits, and actually looking at assessments of habits and building on that thing like Phil's paper, which is linking them to student outcomes. So a move away just from the theoretical. It's like, to give you an example, the literature, the global literature on the habits of mind is insufficient. There is a vast amount of literature out there, but it's too samey. There's too much, just evaluating what I'd call fairly, a lot of self-reported kind of self-assessment of the ages and just general ideas. There's a particular paper that came out that, if you like, exemplifies what I'm talking about, which is a group of researchers, I can't remember the country, they looked at epistemic cognition, habits of mind, and decided to come up with a set of 5 what they call engineering habits of mind for the STEM community. And this is a wonderful idea. But again, the paper loses its value because, yes, they employed some engineers and consultants, and they kind of had this expert panel that decided what these engineering habits of mind would look like. But it never went any further. They just sort of concluded these are the 5 engineering habits. But it was never tested. It was never played out in an engineering college or anything like that. There was no. So, and I feel there's a lot of literature out there that just, it takes us to a point that sort of says, well, yeah, seems like the iHoM are a good idea, but we need more studies that are probing more deeply into how this stuff really plays out in the classroom, because that's where the action happens. And I think our teachers out there need to see more academic research and studies and so on into what this really looks like. How does this affect my practice? So I'd say that's around assessment, around classroom practice. I don't necessarily think there's a deficit at the moment in terms of theoretical understandings of the iHoMs, but I think my study was highly useful, and you can be the judge of that when you actually read the finished article. You might decide it's absolute garbage and roll it up and light the fire with it, and that's absolutely fine too. I do feel it aligned a bit more with Julio's paper, where I thought there was a lot of eliciting of opinion and idea, and I do feel that was a useful paper on research. I thought Philip's paper was useful because that, again, is looking more at what I'm talking about, is really linking these iHoM to actual student outcomes rather than just sort of pie in the sky ideas that, you know, the iHoM seem to be a good thing. And in a nutshell, that kind of sums up where I am at the moment. So, you know, as I say, over the next couple of days, I'll write up my conclusion section, get this thing submitted. The submission really, isn't it? It's like, it doesn't really matter. It's not that relevant because some university professors out there are going to read it and give me some sort of score, and I'll say thanks for that. But the reality is, it's actually, for me, the benefit was actually doing this investigation and what I took from it and what I've gained from it. So,
wow. Thank you so much for sharing, Norman. I'm sure we've all got so many questions. I don't know how ready we are to ask them yet, but I don't know. Has anyone got any burning questions for Norman at this point?
Have you thought much about, I mean, just kind of listening to you go through your smaller threads of a bigger yarn, I had kind of 2 big thoughts. One was, I'm often curious to know who is educating our children.
Yes.
Who are they as people, and what do they embody within themselves intrinsically that brings them to the work? And I often find when I ask that question in my head, working with younger teachers in our mentoring program in our building, they tend to embody most of the habits of mind, but don't recognize those within themselves. Which then kind of led me to my next thought with the word deficit. I think that there's a deficit in understanding what these things look like in action, not necessarily that they're not happening. And like maybe part of the work that comes next is training educators to recognize in themselves the practice of the habits of mind, but also to recognize them when they see them in their school community, and start to kind of categorize and label them when they see them, to see exactly like what's the frequency of the habits of these particular habits of mind, and do they tend to cluster around different disciplines or different subjects? And then how do you mobilize through professional development, bringing the strengths, you know, if habits of mind, the 16 kind of naturally divide up into different areas because of the personalities of the teachers. How do you utilize an entire school community to realize all the habits and practice them mindfully in your day. So I kind of just like stepped out of your paper a little bit and started thinking about like, who's teaching our children? Do they naturally embody these habits of mind? How did they learn them? And how are they expressing them maybe unknowingly to their kids? And how can we train people to see them when they're happening and start to kind of categorize them and collect them and make meaning of them and use them in their teaching more actively?
I think that's a really good point, Jennifer. And it's interesting. One of the subcodes that I had within this area of deficit, it's kind of what do students need, what do teachers need, want. One of them was actually identification of the habits. You know, how
Dr. S, good morning.
Good morning.
Mute yourself, because I'm getting some pretty bad feedback. I think you're probably in the office, so thank you so much. Sorry, Norm.
Yeah, no, I was saying one of those things was identification. It's, you know, how do I identify this habit in a student and so on? And also the subject specificity, which, you know, where you'd get a teacher say, well, look, I want to know what that looks like in an ELA classroom, or I want to know what that looks like in science. So that and when you ask that question, who is it that's teaching our children? Well, I have some controversial views on this, because there are many sort of schools of thought. You know, we sort of say, well, often the older teachers now tend to be more stuck in their ways and so on and so forth, and maybe are not so flexible to move towards contemporary learning styles. But then also on the other side, if you've got these very young teachers who are just out of college, they tend to not have so much life experience behind them. They may not actually have had that much experience working with young people, in fact. And, you know, it's a huge question. Who is teaching these young people? I can't answer that. I just think we've got an absolutely eclectic group of people across this world who are let loose in classrooms, and maybe we need to do a better job globally at actually churning out more effective teachers who I tell you what it does tell me. The teachers we want to be in the classroom are the teachers who are what we, you know, are real reflexive professional practitioners, not the teachers, and they do exist, not the teachers who just want to come to work 8 to 4 and pick up the paycheck. Yes, I've got my college degree and I've got my certification and I'm going to go around the world and teach. No, you want people who are taking on this profession and are passionate about it and are engaged in it, and just they want to learn more about the stuff they do. So when you give them the habits of mind, they don't just look at it as, okay, there's something else I've got to assess. The people who actually take the attitude that says, I want to find out about this, I want to know more about it.
Something that just came to my mind, Norman, wouldn't it be fascinating to pick up with these same participants a year down the line, 2
Yes.
years down the line, where they have had more exposure to the learning paths, of course, more experience in the classroom. They will have had internal PD,
Yep.
you know, from you and others. We will have done, you know, more work with designing these assessment instruments, and then, you know, to have a look and see how that's affected their beliefs, values, and practices.
And I think that will be something I will recommend in my conclusions,
Right.
that, you know, let's revisit this cohort and see what's, you know, a bit further down the road. Yeah. But that's
I'm just so aware of the time, because we're half an hour in already.
Yeah.
But I don't want to kind of cut you off too soon.
No, it's okay. I mean, I know we've got to hear from Daryl.
Yeah, we have got it from Daryl, but I don't know, any quick other questions to Norm whilst we've got him here?
I don't know that it's questions. I have a lot of wondering, and it's always occurred to me that in a certain way it feels almost paradoxical that people are asking for assessment without having a depth of knowledge about what habits of mind are in the first place.
Mm.
So it seems that maybe that's just one and the same question. Maybe the question is, if you could tell me what to look for, I would have a better sense of knowing whether it's growing. And in order to know in order to know what to look for, I have to have some sense of what are some ways that I observe the habits of mind. And the habits of mind are best observed situationally.
Mm-hmm.
So then it leads me to say that if people are just simply saying that what really puzzles me the most is how will I have a rubric for this? How will I have an assessment for this? I think it's leading you down a path that is going to ask for measurable material that will not reflect the authenticity of the work itself. So I wouldn't underestimate that a very important part of knowing whether you're growing with habits of mind has a lot to do with metacognition and has a lot to do with self-assessment.
I
So
think I couldn't agree more, Ben. And I think that it's that, as you just alluded to, they're so situational that it's impossible, for us as a group to say, well, what does that look like? Unless, we're consultants to a school, actually looking at curriculum, looking at, assignments, performance assessments and such forth. So it's very difficult to actually make kind of general assessments and rubrics, and unless you know the actual situation in which students, or it's beneficial to students to apply them.
I do agree, Ben. I think that this identification of what does it look like situated is something that was a recurring theme through these discussions.
that's very real.
And we can also be we can make assumptions as well about what habits should be in play and what habit is appropriate at times, and it does come back to this. We just, people need to know more about them, and
that's the depth of knowledge that I would push for, because I think to ask for assessment in the absence of depth of knowledge is to really trivialize what the experience is to embody the habits.
Yeah, but and you're right. But I think when we go back to Jennifer's question about
Norman, just to say that I think what Jennifer was referencing, which is teachers intuitively often, not every teacher, but many teachers often intuitively are using the habits as a part of their way of really delivering curriculum, for example. As you think about it and you say, I want students to be learning something about, I don't know, the American Revolution, where you begin to think about that is you say, well, what perspectives would I want them to be engaged with? How would I want them to be thinking about this? And you inevitably come to the thinking flexibly. You inevitably come to the idea that you also, when they're out doing research, that you want them to be in the internet striving for accuracy and not just taking the first thing that comes along. So there's a lot that goes into this that I think intuitively many fine teachers believe. However, I'm not sure that they intentionally help students to find out that that's what they're doing.
So I have to agree, because I was asked recently in my doctoral program to talk about a bad assessment I had and a good assessment I had. And it got me thinking, I have only had so many. I had the Iowa reading test, I think, in first grade, and I took a PSAT, SAT in high school. I've only really formally been assessed for anything twice in my life, but all of the good skills and habits I have as a teacher and have come to kind of recognize over the last 10 years of being in a classroom have come from, reading and recognizing and putting labels on things. They were modeled for me in the actions of strong teachers I had growing up. And how lucky was I to have that experience? And now I can bring that to more kids. But I think we have, if we want to apply the word deficit somewhere, we have a deficit of teachers who were not raised in educationally rich environments like that. And these habits were not modeled for them. And now we kind of have to backward teach them and give them back and become mindful and teach them in a direct way. But there are a group of really, I mean, and I think there's less of us now than there has been in the past, but they're not really overtly taught. And I have a hard time assessing them because I feel like the words like data and assessment and rubrics, I know we have to measure things, but like, is that really the right way to measure the habits of mind? Is that the right test to put them to? Is that the right language is there a different assessment or a way of assessing them or seeing them or better language to capture what we're trying to do?
I'm glad you say that, Jennifer, because that's one of the recommendations I have. We need studies done around, more studies done around assessing the habits. It's as simple as that. I just don't think we know enough about it.
It's just such pointed and kind of prickly language to me, where this is this kind of discussion is so much more organic and intuitive and rich, and like it's just such a gelatin thing and not such a prickle thing. I think we need better words for it, and I think we need better assessment tools to find it.
I think there's another aspect to all of this as well, that sometimes in our schools we're so focused on doing and covering material that there isn't that time that's carved out for the metacognition and for stopping and pausing and thinking about the habits of mind. I think as I was going through the pathways modules, what I liked was that it asked, how do you do this with yourself? Then how do you do this with your students? And I think there needs to be more of that, and maybe narrowing of the curriculum so you can have time for the reflections, and that's how it stops being theoretical and actually practical.
Julio, that is so beautifully articulated. God, I might nick those words for my conclusion. No, it's so well said. I honestly believe there needs to be a narrowing of the curriculum. And even a school such as the one where Philip and I, Daryl and Andrew work at, where I think we have narrowed it and deepened it in many ways, I still think we can go further. And I'm going to finish by saying this because it's something that's been on my mind. Look at right. Jennifer was saying earlier that, these young teachers who come in, they are all sort of, they maybe have these habits and they embody these habits, but they kind of don't know how to label them or don't know how to necessarily identify them. I tend to disagree. I think we live in a world right now where we're seeing a young generation come through who are not exhibiting the habits and don't embody the habits. And I'll give you my one example. Look at the divisions we have in this world between the left, the right, the Tories, the Conservatives, the Republicans, the Democrats, the this, the that. I mean, it's just crazy. Look at the wars that are going on between these people, these conversations that take place that are not listening with empathy and understanding, that are not thinking flexibly, that are not looking at multiple perspectives. I don't believe we've ever lived in a world more than before where people are just saying, I'm right, everybody else is wrong. I'm not taking any side on this myself. I don't care what you believe. But if people could, especially these younger generations, actually start listening and hearing each other, we might actually start to have some productive dialogue. But in this world right now, there ain't much productive dialogue. You just got people squabbling like kids, right? At the very top of government,
that's why
organizations.
That's why we borrowed Art and Benner's statement for educating for a more thoughtful world. In our mission and vision. My God, I really do want to give Daryl some time here because he's got some really exciting things to share as well. Let me take a moment though to show you how the Institute is forming, because it's starting to take good shape. So I'm just going to share my screen briefly.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, that was rich.
Can you all see?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So let me get the Institute up. Oh no, I'm in there already. So it's in the local discussions. And then you can see some of these key questions here. But a very good example of how this can evolve is the conversation that myself and Daryl have been having. So we thought we'd kind of model the way that this might look. So we've got some discussions here, actually just about formulating the research questions. So once we had kind of settled on what that particular research question would be, we then migrated the discussion to the research methodology. So it kind of ended there, and then we resumed it here in the research methodologies. So we kind of copy and pasted the research question there and started to have a discussion about what particular research methodology may be applicable for this particular piece of research. So there we go. And I think that maybe over to Daryl then to talk about that process, if that was useful or not, and where this is all going.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I think first of all, I want to try to connect Norman's research to what I'm trying to do. Norman throws up some very interesting discussion points as expected. I'm at the start of my research, but Norman's given me a lot of things to think about. And it connects to your research, of course, as well. And if we are to posit that success in the habits of mind equates to success in performance tasks, then we need to look at how we come to that success. And perception is important in my view in habits of mind analysis. Teacher and student value, habits of mind value, I believe is pretty obvious within CIA first teachers and students. But to what extent do teachers influence student understanding of the habits of mind? And I think that's one of the central themes as we talked about today. We have students who have worked with the habits of mind for 5 years, and teachers who have little to no experience with them at all. So who is teaching who in our classrooms when it comes to the habits of mind? Teachers may not necessarily need to teach the habits of mind, but they simply need the skill to be able to connect the habits of mind to learning activities. And I think it's probably more important that teachers give opportunities to our students to identify and apply the habits of mind, as opposed to teaching the habits of mind, because those are the situated learning aspects I think that Benna was talking about. So it's my research is started off as perception research, but Phil has twisted my arm to go towards a more quantitative approach. In that, I'm going to look at student readiness in the personalized learning to success in the performance task and what that correlation is. And I suppose my research then is going to look at how that is done. And I now need to look at multiple linear regression, which is something I need to get my head around. But practically, I'm going to look at devising some readiness rubrics for 3 of the elements of personalized learning, and then give them a score with self-directed student-generated learning as the higher score, and see if that correlates with student achievement in the performance tasks. But of course, Norman has thrown up lots of other factors in the value of that correlation, and that's what I need to look at, those little nuances as well.
I think that what's particularly exciting about Darryl's research is it's something that we truly don't know the answer to. So there was two very philosophical questions that came up, and you can see that in the discussion on EduPlanet. The first one, very, very fundamental. For personalized learning, is that a goal in and of itself for students to be able to generate within these 7 elements? Or is it just a means to an end? And that end would be, well, success in authentic performance assessments, but extrapolate to success in life. Now that's pretty fundamental in itself. But the assumption that we're going to make for Darryl's research is that the 7 elements of personalized learning are a tool. They're not the goal. So if we make that assumption, the next question, which is also profound, is it the fact that we're using this tool at all that may have an effect on student achievement? Or is it the extent to which those elements are student generated that has an effect on performance? And they're not the same thing either. If you wanted to look at the former, you would basically have a control study where in one group of students you were implementing the 7 elements and one where you weren't, and see if there was any difference. But of course you'd have to factor for the other variables. We're not doing that. We're making, or our hypothesis will be that the further those sliders are to student generated, the more success students will have in the performance task. We truly don't know the answer to that. So those of you that are, have experience with correlational studies, the key is that if everything else remained the same. Now, we're in a good position for this within the conceptual framework that we have, because of course there are so many variables, but actually they were deemed, in my study, to be kind of precursors, if you like. But then looking at, okay, well, we know that the acquired knowledge and skills, we know already that actually has a predictive power. The development of the conceptual understandings, the display of the cognition identified within that unit. But we're adding another one now to say, okay, to quantitatively work out to what extent personalization has happened, to what extent that is student generated. If all of the others were the same, does that have an effect? That's where we're at. Does that make sense?
Yep, to me. Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Sorry.
it makes sense.
I thought you were asking that in general. Yes, it does make sense to me, and I suppose we're looking intrinsically at the value of personalized learning as well here. You know, does personalized learning attribute or contribute to student achievement, and you know, that will come out as well. But so it's that quantitative debate, isn't it? Again, you know, I do look forward to looking and crunching the numbers, but I'm also very interested in what Norman is talking about as well, and the different influences the teacher influence, the student influence. And I don't know, can I include that as well, or is that a separate study and something that
I would argue against it.
Okay.
Daryl. This is huge in itself.
Sure.
And the point is, when you're doing this kind of quantitative study, sample size is important.
Okay.
I think we're okay, because you were saying how many classes?
We're looking at 10 grade 9 classes, which are about 20 to 24. So it's about over 200 students.
So, over 200 data points there that should be able to tell you something quite meaningful in terms of correlation.
Okay.
Excuse me. I'm wondering about, a lot is running through my mind on this. It's really interesting. And I'm just wondering, the 7 elements are elements. So you can't treat them holistically. In other words, each element has its own relationship to the whole. And they're not fractals of one another. And that's never what we were presupposing when we wrote what we wrote. So I'm thinking that to say that if you look at goals, it's going to tell you something about task and audience makes me a little nervous, because I think that each one has its own correlate and relationship. So that's just a question as to how you would make that work. And then another question is that we do, so I do believe that the slider is really important in this, because one of the ways that we've defined personalized learning, and so we don't have the only definition. So you're really working within the definition that Allison and I put forward. But with that definition, we talk about progressively moving toward. So the progressively moving toward is the slider. And so what you're saying is, are you progressively moving toward self-generated material? And there's this whole element that is the elephant in the room that we haven't even named yet, which is, what's the role of motivation in all of this? And how do we really think about that? But if we just put that aside, I just have in the back of my head, and I don't know whether it makes sense or not, that the component parts that I think speak to progressively moving toward are more in voice, co-creation, self-discovery, and social construction. Because that's where the transfer is. And the more I'm listening to both Norman and you, I'm thinking that this whole circle around transfer becomes critically important. It's not so much what you do in the moment as what you hold on to that is sticky enough that it stays with you in the long term. And that's why I thought what Julio was sort of referencing was kind of bringing that alive again, which is, it's really about the transfer and what happens beyond the moment in which you're being instructed. How much do you carry forward within yourself? So all of this is contributing to deepening the thinking about the questions of assessment, for sure. So I don't have the answer to any of what I'm saying. I'm just saying I put some circles around some of this. And I certainly know that when Allison and I studied how we were going to make the cross-section between personalized learning and habits of mind, that juncture was always came back to the idea of where we see student voice, where we see students really showing a deep interest in co-creation and knowing how to really do that developmentally and skillfully, and then how they learn how to use expertise and networks, both among their peers and outside of their peers, and how they really let that influence their thinking, and how they really believe in learning how to be thinking interdependently. And then finally, everything that they discover about themselves is what I think is probably the part that says, when I take that reflective stance that Julio was talking about, what can I say about myself as a learner? And how do I understand how I do this in real time, given complex situations? Because all of it then has to live beyond teacher instruction, curriculum, and what we're telling you and reminding you what you need to do.
Just before I let Daryl respond to some of those, I think that yes, the sliders are elements in and of themselves. However, I would argue that what you've done, you have made factor variables from a latent variable. You've said, okay, you know, the latent variable is personalization, but I can't measure that. I can't adjust that in itself, right? Going back to the whole thing, like, how do I know that Norman loves his wife, right? Well, there are certain behaviors that I would look at there. So I think you've done a great job at that. So if you're kind of going...
What, loving my wife?
You do a great job at that, Norman. Yes, you do. But you know, so we're kind of going, okay, to what extent is the student ready? Because we talk about readiness for personalization, right? And I think that you can look at the sum of those to get some kind of measure for that. And the second thing, yeah, of course, it's about the journey. Yeah, no doubt. But there's also the concept of a snapshot in time, because, you know, we are all at any given moment a point in that journey. And I think it is useful to kind of go, well, where is the student, the individual student at right now in the context of this kind of task? And again, just to let the group know, Darren and I had some discussions about should that be an ever organic slider where we're just having endless conversations with our students about where they want to be. And we thought, yeah, maybe that's just kind of overkill. Maybe that would be counterproductive. So we're kind of going, oh, we know what we've got. We've got the unit, because we got plenty of them going on. And they're doing 4 units in every subject, you know, per course multiplied by 8. So we can use that as a benchmark. And then to link into what both Julio and Norman were talking about, making time in the curriculum for the metacognition, the reflection, feedback and feed forward with teachers. How did that work for you? You know, what are your reflections on the unit? What are your goals for how you could maybe generate some ideas next time? So there you go. I hope that to some degree gave some clarity on the thought processes behind this.
So I certainly don't want you to think I don't think it's a worthy thing to do, because it's more knowledge than we have right now. So I absolutely understand that. I guess I was only trying to think about the complexity of it, yeah, and never forget it.
Oh, this is pretty deep stuff. And it's like, I mean, look, this is the thing, and this is why, let's all be honest here. When we often go into research, right, we have bias. We actually tend to want certain results, yeah. With this, I don't think we do. We really don't know. It's something so new, but it's fascinating to look at, I believe.
Yeah.
I think, you know, another one, and I know, Daryl, you're not 100% certain with this direction, but could just be personalization, you know, to personalize or to not personalize. Does that have an effect? And then I think the hypothesis would that it would. But that's not the same study.
No, it's not.
It's not the same study.
No,
Well-
I just think there's a correlation between the tools of personalized learning and the habits of mind. They're the vehicle that drives the students towards their readiness to be able to transfer. So I think that correlation between success in the personalized learning readiness and the student achievement in the performance task will equate the usefulness of those tools towards the readiness for transfer. I think that's what we're trying to measure, isn't it, Phil?
Oh, that was the other thing that we should
Carol, I think
probably.
it's a very powerful hypothesis.
Yeah.
Which I think is behind your wanting to be more discreet in your measurement.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, do you see a pattern that occurs across time so that as students actually have those experiences unit by unit,
Yeah.
it builds to successively, it
Okay.
builds to a confidence in the capacity to actually become more self-generating. That I think is a really interesting
Yeah.
piece of what you're
So-
studying.
So are you saying that this one-off research might not tell us where we're at with the student readiness? It might just, the snapshot is not as valuable as an ongoing study?
No, I'm saying the snapshot is the beginning
Okay.
of figuring out what an ongoing, it's kind of like, this is the readiness to the next thing.
Okay.
And so I think it's very valuable. But I
Sure.
think the overarching question is the most valuable, which is
Mhm.
what's the incremental step you're taking
Mhm.
toward the larger overarching, which is what gives a student the confidence upon reflection and upon learning what they've done, what gives them the confidence across time to actually become that independent, self-generating student.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
One thing I was wondering. Sorry, go ahead, Vanna.
No, I'm done.
One thing I guess I was wondering with that, Philip, you mentioned the students going through and assessing at the end of the unit. I'm wondering if there's a way for them to understand and know before they get into the unit, these are the habits that I'm driving towards. Throughout the unit, here are some check-in points along the way, and then culminate with that reflection at the end.
Yeah, oh, absolutely right. So, I mean, this was actually another dimension maybe that that Daryl, we should share with the group, because in terms of the habits that are deemed most necessary for the success in the performance task, they're articulated within the UBD framework. So that's clear to the students. Now, but we had some discussion about kind of linking the iHoM to the elements of personalized learning. And actually, Benner and Alison shared some work there.
Yeah.
Again, but that's a separate study in itself. And we decided to not go down that route. So there are some axiomatical assumptions here, right? And one of those is that the iHoM are both necessary and beneficial for personalization. But I think what you're really asking is, how do we ascertain where the student is in this context on those sliders? And that in itself is going to be co-created.
Yeah.
So we are going to look at prior performance assessments within that subject. We are going to have that dialogue. So it's actually a conference.
So we'll look at the readiness of the students through some rubrics that will form an aid to a discussion with the teachers as to where they are on the slider. And I was hoping to connect the habits of mind to that decision. I don't know if that's too much to do in the study, but I would like to include that maybe partially in the study as well. What habits of mind did I use to come to the conclusion that I wanted to go on a student-generated path?
Oh wow! Look, I mean, it's great, Daryl. But I think that just in terms of focusing the research,
Okay, sure.
I think that you definitely talk about that in the literature review, right? To
Okay.
actually say, you know, the theory behind it, and how we believe that the habits of mind are necessary for self-directedness, right? Self-directed and lifelong learning. And I think there's plenty out there about that. And then it's like, yeah, well, okay, we think that. Now we're actually going to test something. But just go back to Julio. So yes,
Okay.
kind of a mixture on prior achievement data, observation from the classroom teacher, and student self-reflection would be that process that determined the starting point at the beginning of the unit, and then at the end of the unit, where they're heading next. So does that answer your question there, Julia? My God, we've been going for more than an hour. I know it's late for a lot of you guys. Again, this has been very rich, very meaningful, and thoroughly enjoyable.
Oh,
So
also one last thing.
I just have to ask Seth. You've been very
Seth,
quiet.
yeah, sorry, you've been very attentive there.
So I just wanted to give you a chance to say what's on your mind, if there's anything you wanted to share.
I partly just listening, trying to figure out sort of, you know, where the tension lies with regards to being able to, you know, go from the theoretical to the practical, and going from, you know, what do we see and observe and hear with regards to the habits of mind. I don't know, just sort of thinking those kind of situations as far as folks have talking. And honestly, the other thing is just where the different roles are, because I think we've got some different ideas on research and what we're interested in. And I think, Philip, you talked a little bit about, you know, how we might get into smaller groups and have these, because we were at 12, or no, I guess 9, 10, 11, I think there were 11 of us at one point, and even at that point, it's a big group to managing and get all voices in. So
I think you've got a great point there. So once I truly want everybody to be editors of the Institute. I'm actually still waiting for EduPlanet to kind of sort that out, because at the moment I think I'm the only one that can create these topics, etc. Should be everyone, I think.
Yeah, they're making that happen.
Right. So yeah, absolutely right. And I think you'll see those conversations naturally, you know, develop into smaller kind of break-off groups. But then I think, look, you know, if any of the group are particularly interested in both, you know, teachers' beliefs and values, and the effects of professional development, then the idea is to build off Norman's research, right? To not always start from zero, to try and, you know, avoid those redundancies. The second point is that, you know, the work that Daryl's doing, it really is just a continuation of the research that I started. So that's kind of another avenue, and there will be more. So once everyone has those editing rights, feel free to just start up a new topic and go, hey, this is the direction I'd like to see this go. Yeah, for sure.
Andrew, we didn't hear from you either.
Hello, Benna. Yeah, I'm fortunate enough to work with Norman, Daryl, and Phil, so I already kind of have some understanding of where their thesis and papers are going. So I was mostly just kind of listening for other feedback from other people that have not been involved, because Norman unofficially kind of asked me some of those same questions about intrinsic versus innate or taught. And so I've had kind of that dialogue, and I guess just that one point I kind of thought about for me, because as Jennifer also kind of alluded to, with how to get these educators to see that maybe they're actually doing the habits. I kind of grew up the same way. I'm in a very rich educational family, and a lot of these habits to me are just natural. But now, actually being in an organization where it's part of it, I can actually start to self-identify when I'm doing this. And then furthermore, working with Norman, Daryl, and Phil is just, with the habits, just I'm getting a lot of information. So, but yeah, I am very interested in to see how Norman and Daryl's papers turn out. And then once I keep just getting this information, hopefully I can start to contribute on my own.
So that's great. So let's make sure we keep it very open so that it doesn't mean you have to piggyback on these research pieces, but you might start a whole new pathway. I think that's a little bit of what you're thinking about, Seth. So I think it would be very welcome. Okay.
Yeah. One more thing.
I just couldn't let you stop without making sure everybody had a chance to say
No,
something.
you're quite right, Benna. Yes.
So
okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Yeah, and I think all of us, most of us, will be reconvening in a couple of weeks for the more general call, and then hopefully by that time, Daryl's going to have made some progress. Maybe Seth and Andrew's, decided to take things in a different direction. Keep collaborating on the institute, and we'll reconvene in a month.
And happy birthday, Daryl.
Oh,
yeah, happy birthday, Daryl.
Is it your birthday today, Daryl?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, wow. Happy birthday, mate.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye for now, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Yeah,